Hi everyone. I was just giving it a minute or two to let everyone join, but we're at quite a good number now, so I'll get going. So thank you all for joining us today, and welcome to the event. My name is Beth and I work in the marketing team here at Burn Sheehan. For those of you who don't know, Burn Sheehan are a specialist technology recruitment consultancy specializing in product, software and engineering, tech ops, data and senior hires. Today's event is going to be all around OKRs and what they are and their advantages and disadvantages, as well as how to implement them. So I'm going to hand over to Max, who is a senior agile coach at Moo, who will be moderating the discussion today, and I'll let him introduce you to the panel. So over to you, Max.
Thanks, Beth. And yeah, hello, I'm Max. As Beth mentioned, I'm a senior agile coach at Moo, and I currently support all of the tech and product teams in the organization, and also help to manage the process and tools that we use to deploy strategy in the business, one of which is objectives and key results, better known as OKRs, also our topic for today. I'm joined by a wonderful panel made up of talented product people who'll be sharing with us their experiences of working with OKRs in different types of organizations, what makes a great OKR, what are some of the common anti-patterns to look out for, and some of their secrets to success. We'll have around 45 minutes of panel discussion where I'll be directing questions to our panel members, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A at the end. We'd love you to submit your questions via the Q&A function in Zoom throughout the event, and we'll try our best to answer as many of these as we can. You can find the controls for this in Zoom at the bottom of your screen. So yeah, fire them in as and when you think of one. You might be wondering though, who is on the panel? So before we kick off, I'd like to welcome our panelists and ask them to introduce themselves to you. First up, we'll go to Callum.
Hi folks, I'm Callum. I'm a senior product owner at Moo, so I work with Max really closely. Moo is a stationery and custom product company, so we make everything from business cards to notebooks to water bottles with cool artwork, logos, designs printed on them, where every product is unique. My job at Moo, I look after our post-order services and technology. So a lot of my customers are primarily internal operations teams, but we do have a big impact on our end customers, given the last impression is a lasting impression. So everything delivery, manufacturing, shipping related. Hi.
Thank you, Cal. Next up, we'll go to Maggie.
Hi everyone, I'm Maggie. I'm a senior product lead at Auto Trader. I look after our consumer selling proposition, so looking after private advertisement and also instant cash offer. I've been in product for about 10 years. I started off in academic publishing and spent a little bit of a lifetime in a product strategy consultancy where I worked with OKRs at NHS Digital and had a really good experience there. So looking forward to talking about them today.
Thanks, Maggie. Next up, we'll go over to Morgan. Hello.
Hi, Max, and hi, everyone. I'm Morgan. I'm a senior product manager at Not on the High Street, the UK's home for online gifting, I believe is what I meant to say at this stage. I've been a SPM with Not on the High Street only for a little while, for about 3 months now. But prior to that, I've worked in product organizations as small as little startups and as big as Tesco. And before that, my background's in operations management. So an awful lot of experience with setting and managing objectives and this world of OKRs. So looking forward to talking about it today.
Thank you, Morgan. And last but not least, we'll go over to Holly.
Hi, I'm Holly. So I'm the head of products at Co-op. I'm accountable for our multidisciplinary digital teams in the funeral care business. And so that means that we look after the funeral care website for the Co-op, as well as our internal platform that all our colleagues use to administer everything to do with the business. So heavily involved in things like product strategy and roadmaps, and have team leadership responsibilities. And before that, I was the product director for the leading B2B pension software administration company in the UK called Aquila Hayward. And so they're a very contrasting company to the Co-op because they're a very small business. And I've got experience of implementing OKRs in both of those businesses and understanding the trials and tribulations of doing that. So really looking forward to talking about it more today.
Lovely, thank you, Holly. Lots of amazing and varied experience amongst our panelists. Before we jump into some of the detail on the good, the bad and the ugly when it comes to OKRs, I'd like to ask Holly, what are OKRs and how can they be useful?
Yes, so OKRs stands for Objectives and Key Results. And really what they're there to do is to set a common goal and direction for companies and teams to work towards. And ideally, you can set those at a company level, and then individual teams will then set their OKRs that feed into that company level. And it's a framework that can work in 3 parts. So the idea is you set the inspiring goal, and then you ensure that you're always progressing that goal, and then you set a cadence to make sure that you're reminding yourself regularly of what those goals are and holding each other accountable for working towards those, so that you're always giving them priority, because it's very easy for them to get forgotten about. And they're really helpful in terms of encouraging teams and businesses to measure their success by outcomes rather than by outputs. And I've seen the impact in teams in terms of being able to start to empower people to work towards solutions, and it helps people feel motivated in their roles as well, because it means that they can actually they understand why they're working on what they're working on and how that contributes to the company success, how that contributes to customer success, and also they can have a part in terms of coming up with the best way to achieve that and use their skills and expertise to do that. And I've seen the impact of doing this in teams where if you are in a team where the exec or senior leadership of the team are handing solutions to the team saying, just build this thing, just build this thing. So for example, we've had that build this book appointment online solution. Nobody understands why that's important. People can be a bit skeptical about, well, why are we doing this? Because it's not really going to deliver value to the business. And it can be quite demotivating for a team, and it doesn't feel like a shared effort in the right direction. But then when we implemented OKRs, it was a vastly different story, because suddenly the team could come up with hypotheses of how we would achieve that OKR. They picked 4 top hypotheses and actually came up with 97 different solutions just for those top 4 hypotheses. Everybody was really engaged. It meant that we were measuring value from the start. We were understanding what the metrics were that we needed to change, and it meant that we could actually then track progress against that as well. So it's not just about being able to define what you're trying to do, it's a really big motivator for teams as well.
Thank you, Ollie. Yeah, great answer. And yeah, really interesting distinction there around using it as a tool to engage with all people in the business, not as a tool to dictate work to people. Amazing. We've got one question in actually, Ollie, which I'll pass back to you. What is the difference between a key result and a KPI? That comes from Deepali.
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. So key results are aimed at a change that you're trying to make. So your OKRs are aimed at trying to make a change to a specific area or a specific metric. So we'll get into kind of probably what OKRs look like in a bit, but the idea is that you'll set some really key things that if we make this change, the KRs are the indicator that show us that this change is actually happening. Whereas the KPIs tend to be more about health and overall ongoing operational metrics. So it might be these are the things that we need to keep an eye on at all times. So we always need to be watching our traffic coming in or our conversion rate, or we always need to be watching the team health, or we always need to be watching I don't know, something around security. There's, it can cover lots of different fields, but the things that no matter what you're doing, you always need to be keeping an eye on.
Yeah, thank you very much. So the next question up, I'm going to pass this to all of the panelists, but Maggie, I'll start with you. How might a business structure itself around OKRs?
It's a good question. I think one of the most difficult things when you start to structure around OKRs is getting the scale right, because I think Holly sort of mentioned that it's sort of boxes within boxes in it, because it has to align to the overall strategy. And one of the main reasons for having them is aligning effort to strategy. So I'd say start start small, like start in your teams thinking about the effort that you're putting out and looking at the strategy and start drafting those OKRs. I think if you go for perfection and try to build a tree of OKRs throughout the business, a lot of times the OKRs sort of become unwieldy. So I'd say in true product thinking fashion, give it a go with a small experiment and then start to build from there as you see successes and as you start to get more comfortable with the format. But it always has to align to that upper level vision, and just, yeah, give everybody should have a bit of patience with themselves about getting the scale right, because you want to make sure that the objective that exists within a team is in their control. It doesn't have heavy dependencies. It really is something that they're striving for, and it's not something that they're looking at that feels much out of their control, or maybe in a completely different team or at a different strategic level. So I would say, yeah, start small and start to expand as you continue to go up with them.
Thank you very much, Maggie. Morgan, I'll pass this question to you next.
Always fun, isn't it, to wonder who's going to be picked on next in these things. But no, I think one thing that's really important is to consider, Dipali, I'm actually just going to talk about exactly what you're asking. Where is your organization as you're entering this journey? So are you used to, for example, looking at outcome-based results already? You've just not got that OKR and formal structure around it. Are you product-led, or are you currently led by initiatives and by projects? Because that can make a difference. Who in the business is going to be responsible and accountable for shepherding those OKRs? So I think where the business is more mature and the business is more able to put that structure in place, it might be easier to deliver against OKRs. If you work in the smallest little startup, then actually you probably do need to be more flexible around your thinking, and things might need to change more rapidly. That might make it harder to implement an OKR framework, but I think it's still worth shooting for, well, what are we actually hoping to get out of this work? Because otherwise, how will you possibly measure those results, even if you are a small bootstrapped team?
Yeah, thank you, Morgan. I think that cultural shift that takes a business from outputs to outcomes is something that has to come along as well when you're starting to use OKRs. Okay, Callum, I'm going to pass this one to you next.
So I will try not to repeat any things that have already been said, because I massively agree. I think one area of thinking about a business is a big thing. And I think you have to kind of accept that OKRs are not designed for every problem. They never have been. So if you are a product team and you're primarily focused on a strategic direction, and you are looking for that kind of outcome-based work, then I think OKRs are a really good way to structure teams cross-functionally if you can as well. So it's great to look at different levels of the organization and what makes sense. And I think Maggie's point's pretty spot on, like don't go, this is what it's going to look like as an end state. Here you go, everyone, now please do this. Equally, I think I sort of hinted at it with when you're not a product team, or if you are a product team that has a particularly high amount of hate the word, but BAU type activities. You have a lot of support functions. You're very reactive by default. Maybe you're like potentially even like platform teams or operations teams that you work really closely with that are less product and tech driven. Those teams don't really have that big focus of their time being on strategic work. So therefore OKRs can feel slightly forced. And that's where maybe things like KPIs or like service level indicators or service level objectives are a lot healthier to get the outcomes you want, because they're more monitoring of performance. So yeah, my thoughts.
Thanks, Cal. And yeah, last, I'll pass this one to Holly.
Yeah, I think some really good points there. I think covered off. I think just to echo everybody's points, I think it's really about progress over perfection for these things. I know I've had quite a few conversations with people saying, oh, well, we can't do OKRs because my organisation leadership don't do OKRs and we need it to cascade down. But that's actually okay. It's just about finding what works for you within your context and knowing that it might not be a perfect implementation of it as you would read in a book. So it might be a case that actually as a team you go, okay, we've kind of got an idea of the vision, but we're going to put some OKRs in place. And actually what can happen is if you've not got a very good well-defined vision from the top of the company, by starting to set OKRs, it can start to gain clarity on that, because it opens up those conversations with your leadership team around, well, what are we trying to achieve, and where are we heading? So it's a really good tool for actually starting to open up those conversations, and it can start to kind of help the organization mature as well. And yeah, like others have said as well, in terms of making sure that, you know, look at the workload that you've got coming in and be realistic about the work you've got coming in, because actually it might be that you spend a small amount of time on strategy, and you might only set one OKR. You might just say we're going for one objective, and it's better to do that than to set 20, because you're much more likely to succeed on that as well.
Yeah, thanks, Holly. So thank you all for your answers on that. Some really interesting points. I think, you know, that taking a continuous improvement mentality to anything you do, including OKRs, is really important. And yeah, using time as an enabling constraint can be very powerful for a business to measure their success against any goals. Okay, so the next question, I'm going to pass this to Maggie first, and the rest of you can jump in as and when you see fit. So what does a good OKR look like?
This is the $1 million question, isn't it? I think really carrying on in what my fellow panelists have said about kind of don't get too focused on perfection. I think there are a few kind of good guidelines or golden rules, and that's really about that outcome-based thinking around particularly your objectives, and be aspirational with confidence. I think one of the things when you're doing OKRs, you look at them, you want to just push yourself to that kind of comfortable edge of what you think you can achieve, and think about the status quo. So I've seen organizations maybe think about what we're going to do. We're doing their OKRs, not thinking about what the team is actually. So when defining your outcomes, be aspirational with confidence, make sure that it is outcome based, and think about that qualitative. I think when you get to key results, and you're starting to draft your key results, which are really the way that you measure progress towards that target, which is in the outcome. Look at what you measure and what you have available to you, is because a lot of times when you're doing your key results, if you can't actually measure it, it makes it really difficult to try to track progress towards that objective. And then in the end, I said borrow from the best. There's so many examples out there, and I found it really helpful when I was consulting, when I went into a new industry, to look at examples from that industry, and I think that can help you break out of maybe over wordsmithing, which I would say is probably the biggest pitfall. So yeah, keep it outcome oriented, make sure that you can measure the things that you want to measure, and don't get bogged down with perfection.
I think when considering those outcomes, another really important thing is to make sure that you don't build OKRs in a way that you've made those outcomes too narrow and defined a solution to a problem. When you're setting those OKRs, you don't want to then get into a pitfall where your product managers, where your UX designers, where your researchers have already been told, to deliver this OKR, I have to go down this road. This has to be my solution. So for example, if you want to grow the number of orders on the site, that's a good OKR. But if you said, I want to sell more of item X, that might be a less good OKR, because actually you might be able to deliver the business result of increased orders through increasing orders of items Y and Z instead. So I think it's important to consider, is this broad enough? Does this still give people enough room to flex? Or have I made this goal too narrow for the organization?
Yeah, such an important point. The how is sort of left out of the outcome, isn't it? That's where you get to do the hypothesis and this experimentation.
One thing I really like about the best OKRs I've seen and used, and they're definitely not all like that. It's a roller coaster. Sometimes we really miss the mark, but I think sometimes a really good OKR setup can be where you have your objective really is your primary goal, right? That's where you're trying to instill your focus, and often the key result can or key results can be gamifying achievement of that objective to an extent. So really good OKRs in my head often look at the anti-patterns as well as the success metrics. So don't just come up with what your desired key result is, also come up with the result that would potentially sort of allow you to see whether you'd accidentally gunned after the key result, but not at the expense of the objective. So I think having like an example of that, maybe I've seen done really well in the past. The platform team I worked in, one of our objectives were all around the scalability of our platform and about how how easy it was and self-empowering it was for teams to make change. And the really good sort of balance that I saw was around increased number of deployments, but also a reduction in the number of developer-caused incidents and outages. So we're making sure that we're not just increasing it at the expense of stability of the platform. So I think that can work really well, where you sort of have key results that check yourself to make sure you're staying on task.
And some other things to consider as well is making sure that the key results are stretching enough. So when you first set your key results, you should look at those and ideally have about a 50% confidence rate that you're going to be able to hit them. So you want them to be stretching, but not impossible, because impossible would be incredibly demotivating as well. So it's about getting that balance of actually, this is a stretch goal. And if you're starting to achieve your 100% of your OKRs every time, then that's a sign that maybe you're not setting them in a stretching enough way. And sometimes that can be a bit uncomfortable in certain organizations, if depending on the culture. So if you're doing that, it's important to make sure that that's communicated as well. But I think it probably is a reflection as well that those OKRs need to be measurable on kind of a scale that's you're able to kind of measure numbers on. I'm trying to think of the right word there, but they're not binary. So it's not a yes or no, we've achieved that. It's we've achieved 70% of that or 60% of that. And then another thing to consider is making sure that your KRs don't kind of repeat each other. So for example, it's ideally you don't want two KRs that results which both refer to revenue, for example. It's good to kind of focus on different elements of success. So you might have a revenue driven one, but then you might also have a retention based one or a quality based one. So it's worth to think about the different angles of what success looks like, so that you're not just solely focused on revenue, because often that's what our stakeholders will ask you about, but actually it can be a really useful tool for bringing awareness that success and that value comes in different forms as well.
Yeah, thank you all. I think that mix of leading and lagging indicators is really important, that you all sort of touched on there, so you can see progress towards that goal before you actually get there as well. Okay, great. We've covered a lot of ground there. So next up, I'd like to ask Callum, how can you reflect on OKRs and learn from them? How can you use them as a tool to help your organisation learn?
So I think this is definitely an area that I think personally need lots of improvement on. Using OKRs is really popular at the start of a quarter. I think that's probably what most people that use them's experience is. The fact that we use OKRs doesn't suddenly make us really good at reflection. And most sort of portfolio level planning processes have been through in various guises, have the same kind of overinvestment up front and a real sort of lack of interest at the tail end. So your point just on closing there, Max, that how leading and lagging an indicator is this? For me, if you can visualize your progress in some way, you sort of force yourself into doing this by default. So the preference, I think, a lot of places is that you plan in quarters. Certainly at Moo, we still have this kind of quarterly planning cycle where often we try and orientate our OKRs around those quarters. I think breaking out of the time cycle would be one really good thing. So it shouldn't matter that you have a quarter's worth of OKRs. There may be desires above to do that, but I think in terms of your team and yourself as a product owner or product manager, you should try and veer away from just sticking to 3 monthly cycles that chime in at random points of the year. So if you can visualize things and you can remove the time boxed nature to some of the OKRs, just to make yourself more focused on the outcomes, I think that would be a really positive way of being able to reflect on them. Things I've done probably in a more practical way with the teams I've worked with that I've really liked is stay away from them being the product person's thing. Like I shouldn't care any more than the team should. It is a really good sort of litmus test as a product person when using them. Ways that have worked well for doing that is getting the team involved in setting them. So it's great to be the product person and really pushing the objective, because largely, to sort of push into Polly's question, objectives are a why statement often. They're kind of impugn the value of the work you're doing or going to be doing. If you can drive the why and the objective and really work with the team or a group of cross-functional people to come up with the key results, then I think whenever people set goals or targets or key results themselves, they're more likely to use them. So I think that's a really big way to get people bought in on getting feedback on them. Equally, if your team are not using them and you're not reflecting on them, it's fine that you got it wrong. I think that would be my other bit of advice. Very, very frequently, I've realized that we are not using key results in a measurable way, and often it's because they were wrong. The reflecting on them to understand why they were wrong is just as important as whether you're hitting them. So I think like it's fine to screw this up frequently, and you'll get it right one time, get it completely off the mark the next time. Again, removing that time box part means that you should constantly be questioning what you're doing and why.
And any other thoughts on this one from our other panel members?
I think it's a really good point around getting the teams involved. I think if you do your OKRs and put them in a drawer to open up 90 days later to see if you've hit them, or if it's just the product person, then it's really not working for you. And I think incorporate them into your other products methodologies. If you use story maps or in your rituals, so that they're there in present, so that you can think about the work incoming, especially if you're in a fully kind of realized service, you can look at the incoming kind of feedback and see how it aligns to what you have. I think you have to live them through whatever cycle you decide to give them as time in terms of a time box. So yeah, I think and be prepared to pivot. You may learn something fundamentally different than in what you thought when you set the OKRs, and I think that's really important, that even if you're midway through what you've determined as your time box, that it's okay to change or decide to pivot to something different.
Yeah, I think the first time or the first couple of times you use OKRs, probably, you know, you have a really big learning journey on that because you'll find out, I mean, certainly I've definitely fallen into that trap with teams where we get to 2 months into a 3-month time box of an OKR and we kind of look at them and go, yeah, we haven't done any of those yet. So I think some of it is just even that awareness and building that awareness of how easy it is for other work to come in and to divert you off priorities, and then you start to learn to how do you get focus as a team and focus as an organization to make sure that you're working on the things that really matter and that you've set out that really matter, and inevitably that can often involve saying no to people and having those difficult conversations. But I think it's a really good way of highlighting perhaps where you haven't got that focus, and you know, it gives you a really good structure for making sure that for holding yourselves accountable and making sure that you are measuring those things that you say you're going to measure, because it can be so easy, and you know, product teams are often really busy under huge amounts of pressure and demand, and you know, it can be so easy for metrics and measuring outcomes to start to fall by the wayside in certain companies and environments. And I think it's a really good way of just having an extra check-in and holding yourselves accountable to making sure that what you're building is actually having the impact that you were expecting and hoping for it to have.
I think if you'll allow me a brief tangent, Max, away from the questions, I think it's an important point. We've talked a lot about time boxing. And I think one thing that's really important to remember with OKRs is, yes, we do often and tend to operate on like a quarterly time boxed cycle, but some of the most meaningful initiatives for your organization might not deliver in a quarter. They might not deliver in 6 months. They might not deliver in a year. If you need to do a replatforming or you need to do some kind of big fundamental work. So I think it's really important to understand that whilst OKRs can be very powerful, they can also inhibit progress if we only look at initiatives that we can actually deliver within that usual time box. So we need to have the ability to flex out of the time box as well where necessary to get bigger pieces of work done.
Yeah, thank you, Morgan. Really good point there. We talked a little bit there about this kind of set and forget mentality, which I've certainly witnessed and been a part of in using OKRs in the past. But I'm going to pass this one back to Callum. I'd like to pass it to all the panel members as well. What are some of the other common challenges, anti-patterns, or pitfalls that you've experienced when it comes to OKRs?
Loads. I think we've got another half hour at least between us. So no, I think we've touched on a few of them. First up for me, OKRs don't solve every problem. So if you're trying to sort of crowbar a key result against what is perhaps a more binary projecty type initiative, you're sort of kind of breaking the Agile manifesto, and you're just jumping through the hoops for the sake of it. You're not going to use it like that. Don't waste your time. You'll demotivate everybody that comes into contact with using them, and I think it will hurt you longer term. So yeah, if you have a project, I don't know, it feels very difficult to get that measurability because it's quite binary. It's fine for that to be a project. I wouldn't try and make it a key result or try and retroshift it. Other things, I think, yeah, avoid linking too heavily. So reporting on initiatives and objectives and key results, that can be quite closely tempting. I would try and maybe keep the two separate in the way that you report on them. At Moo, we use working groups quite closely to talk about maybe more initiative-based problems, where we're more focused on the delivery and planning aspects, where we'll have sort of almost separate groups that look at the review all of our objectives and key results to make sure that we are on track. And I think another probable pitfall we spoke about was using objectives and key results for every team in the same way. So the 5 years I've been at Moo, we've tried lots of different things. Not always been OKRs, but quite for the majority of that period, it has been. We've gone from company level to sort of quite top-down driven OKRs, you know, Moses tablets kind of style thinking. We've done the complete opposite, where teams have come up with their own OKRs completely independently. I think neither is perfect. Don't expect it to be. We had OKRs on going bowling when we completely devolved it to teams, and that's fine if it fits in amongst the other work, but it maybe isn't the same kind of outcomes that the more senior folks are looking for when they're using them. Equally, coming up with really company level ones doesn't mean that it's going to translate really well for every team. So I think you have to kind of find your happy medium, and just try and get as many benefits as you can at the expense of the lowest amount of costs. And everyone sort of hinted on it, like trial and error is sort of the way these things go, and it's not going to be the same for every team. So don't expect it to be at the outset. Yeah, I'm going to shut up for a bit and I'll jump back in if there's other stuff as well.
Yeah, I think I've definitely experienced quite a few pitfalls. I think one of the ones that really sticks in mind is that we just spent far too long trying to define them. So, you know, we went for the opposite approach to being the product manager setting them, and we went for the whole team working on it. So we worked as a team and had several workshops to kind of work through, well, what are the objectives? Spent hours debating what is an objective versus what the key result was. Eventually got to the point where we defined our objectives and key results and got it down to 3 OKRs with key results underneath, and then realised we needed to get our stakeholders bought into it as well and get a lot of our key stakeholders. So then we went around this huge process of going around all our stakeholders, introducing OKRs to our stakeholders, by which point 6 weeks had passed and we're already halfway through the time period that we should have actually been working on the OKRs. So I think, you know, it's very easy to kind of fall into that trap of, you know, there's don't, as a product person, don't be the only one doing it in isolation, and don't just kind of hand them over to a team, but at the same time making sure that you don't fall into that trap of needing to run it past every single person in the company as well before you can kind of agree them, because you can just burn through so much time doing that. And actually it's like kind of, maybe it's a soft launch, maybe this time we just do it with a team, maybe next time we start to socialize it with some of our stakeholders, maybe the time after that we actually get more input as they get used to working them. Think about how you can set up steps to get to that point. You don't have to go all the way in one go. I'll give somebody else a chance to talk because I think it's a bit cathartic, this part.
I feel like you been in my life, or the one you just explained. I've been through the exact same thing with like the you 6 weeks in and you're still getting them sort of socialized. I think there's a lot of pitfalls, but the biggest one I would mention is that they become some sort of intense reporting mechanism. So you do them as a team and you feel really good about them, and all of a sudden you're being asked, what's going on with objective 3, and I think once it becomes a sort of progress reporting framework rather than really being for the team to feel aligned towards common goals, it is when it can start to feel uncomfortable, and you start to lose that investment in them.
Yeah.
Sorry, go on, Max.
No, sorry, Cal, I interrupted you there. Go ahead.
I was just while Maggie was talking, I was scribbling away because there's 2 others that I could think of that just came up in my mind. So interesting ones I think of that we do at the moment. I think it serves its purpose because in some cases we've missed the mark with our results. Try and understand why, if you are doing like a RAG status or a measure of some kind, you're meant to be talking about results that are measurable. So if you're not talking about the result and you're coming up with some kind of surrogate measurement tool, then something's maybe not right. And that might be fine, but I think just make sure that you're doing as much of the reporting on the actual measures as you can. The other one, I think with OKRs is the K bit. So it's key. It's not meant to be everything that you're doing ever. We very recently had a really nice experience where we killed one of the 2 OKRs, one of the 2 key results, sorry, that we had under an objective, because it just wasn't feasible. And also we weren't really spending and dedicating much time in working on it in that way. So I think if you can make sure that they are key things that you're looking to spend your time on. And the easiest way to think about that is, and this should be sort of gospel for product people, but does it help you say no to other stuff? Because it should. That's kind of the point of them. So hopefully it's as useful a tool to preventing your time being spent on other focuses as it is for the focus that you're coming up with in the first place. Which, yeah, I think that would be a big pitfall that I've often done.
Thank you very much. So yeah, kind of linked to one of the comments that Maggie made then, and this is a question for you, Morgan. Is it possible to become too focused on OKRs, and how can this hinder you and your team?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's a couple of aspects to this that I want to cover off. So the first is you can fall into a hole where you decide that every piece of work must be sponsored by an OKR. And then it stops being a case of guidance and help and becomes product managers figuring out how to make a piece of work tangentially related to enough OKRs that can sponsor the work to do the work. And it just becomes farcical. It's like, why are we even doing this in this case if I'm just going, oh, I'll make this link to this one? So I think it's really important to remember that some work can come in that doesn't necessarily link to the OKRs and is still of value. And then I think the other thing is with the time boxing we've talked about, it can make us slower to respond to emerging problems and emerging trends, because we've gone, oh, well, we've set this quarterly time box now, though. So let's think about this next quarter when we have a new time box to play with and we can set some new OKRs. And actually, it might sometimes be important to go, no, we need to scrap this. We need to change our focus because this is a bigger opportunity or a bigger problem or a regulatory hurdle that we weren't expecting to see. So I think it can make you less responsive if you're not careful.
Yeah, thank you, Morgan. I think it's a really interesting one as well. There's a kind of theme in those last few comments from all of you around, like OKRs aren't strategy. They're not your company's strategy. They're a tool that you can use to help you, measure yourself against it, ideally towards that company strategy. So yeah, really important stuff there. So one last question, and I'm going to pass this to all of you, but we'll start with Holly. What would you change about OKRs if you could change anything?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think it would be really good if there is a way of kind of, I'm trying to think of words. So I think if we could, it's getting organisations more bought into it really, and getting that framework translated down to people, because, and it's almost more of a, I think it's almost the guidance of what goes alongside it as well. So I think it's helping people understand how this can relate in the real world, because I think there's lots of books written about OKRs and how to implement them and how to work with them, but actually it's all the things that go alongside it. So we've spoken about the KPIs and how that works. We've spoken about how actually you still need to be able to flex around different pieces of work and be able to say, actually, yes, that's not related to the OKR, but it's really strategically important, so we have to do it and we need to do it within this time frame. And I guess it's giving that flexibility, because I think it can become a bit of a rigid framework if you're not careful. So it's giving that flexibility to teams at the same time as giving the direction.
Thanks, Ollie. Over to Morgan next.
Yeah, I think I'd echo that idea of increased flexibility. So making sure that as an organisation, you're clear with teams that whilst the OKRs are there, they're not gospel, and they can be overwritten, they can be changed, they can be improved, even mid-cycle. And we don't have to keep banging a drum that doesn't seem to be doing anything just in service of the OKR.
I've definitely worked in organisations before where there's been a bit of a mentality of management by blog post of, I read that this person does it this way, so this is how we do it. So yeah, flexibility definitely key. Maggie, over to you next.
Yeah, I'm probably echoing a lot of the same, but I think I would, if I could change one thing, I would get rid of this notion that there's this perfectly beautifully written academic version of an OKR, and when you type it, a bell rings somewhere and you've got it. I think I just don't think it exists. So I think, you know, if it's good for you and the team feels motivated by it, and that you have that flexibility to change and pivot and respond to new information, yeah, it's if you can really get dragged down by trying to be academic about it, I think.
Thanks, Maggie. And Callum, last but not least, over to you.
I think from my wish list of stuff, if all problems could be solved, I really like visualizing metrics in some ways. Often, like when I think about problems or companies generally, there'll be some kind of revenue equation or a cost equation that generally dictates, like e-commerce, it's your visitors, your returners, your checkout percentage, and your basket value, etc. And all those things link to each other. With OKRs, it's the same, right? It's not like the key results exist in isolation. So I think what I'd like to see more in planning cycles is visualizing I think the closest I've seen to this is like an opportunity solution tree, if people have ever worked with those before. I'd like to see those used as the way that we get to understanding why we're focusing in specific areas, because the context is really, really hard to interpret when you get single sets of results with a quite personally like very vague message objectives. I hate objectives where it's, we're going to increase revenue by X. You know, the anti-pattern of that is like, we're not going to decrease revenue, so that it's almost non-valuable to me to say that. So I think what I'd like to see is more improved ways of visualizing how we get to an objective and a key result. And I think that would allow teams much more of spoke about like a Kanban style way of reacting to these problems and focusing on stuff in less defined time periods and boxes. So yeah, I think that would be a really good way to provide focus for setting them.
I think that's a really good point, Callum, around the OKR of increased revenue, because yeah, I've definitely worked in those teams and environments before as well, where that's the strategy, is to increase revenue, but actually that's not, you know, it's not really a strategy and it's not really an objective. It's a key result, so you can kind of have your key result to increase revenue, but your objective needs to be more meaningful about how are you going to do that, not in terms of the solution, but in terms of what area of focus are you going to work on in order to get that result.
That's where you have to really balance the idea we talked about earlier of broadness with still being useful, because we can go too broad, right? It's no point having an OKR of do good things. We have to be very specific. We have to be specific enough that we're focusing in a certain area, whilst broad enough that we can explore lots of potential solutions within that area, which is a really tricky balancing act, potentially one of the trickiest things of everything we've discussed today.
Yeah, thank you all very much. So that kind of brings us to the end of the kind of structured panel discussion that we had. So now we'll move into the Q&A portion of the event. We have a few questions in already, but please submit yours via the Q&A function in Zoom. But to start us off, I'm going to go to Holly. Deepali asks, a lot of times teams get confused between an initiative and an objective. What is the best way to make teams understand the difference?
Yeah, so I think an initiative is effectively how you're going to achieve that objective, and you might have several initiatives that might help you achieve an objective, or you might have initiatives and not objectives as well. But in terms of OKRs, so I think if it's an initiative and I'd assume that's basically a solution, or we're going to build this feature, or we're going to do this particular thing, then that's going to help us achieve an objective. I think if you've got a situation where somebody's saying that, I think it's the 5 whys can be really helpful. So it's kind of like, so why do you want to do that? What are you going to achieve by doing that? And keep asking that, you know. So great, if we build this online appointment booking feature, for example, I could do that with my exec. So what are we going to get as a result of doing that? Oh, well, actually, it means that we're going to have less dropouts in this part of the journey. Great. And what does less dropouts in this part of the journey mean? Oh, well, actually, that means that we're increasing our share of the market effectively. So you can keep asking why to get to the real objective behind that.
Yeah, thanks, Holly. And we've got another question from Deepali that's in a similar topic. So Maggie, should there be a one-to-one relationship between KRs and initiatives?
I saw that question and I was pondering it, because I think, like Holly, I think that the initiative is usually kind of the intervention or change that you're introducing in order to achieve your objective. But I do think there are some initiatives and change which may hit multiple bells. So I don't think you should strive for one-to-one, but you should think about the interventions that you're introducing and then how they map up to the strategic goals that you have. They're probably more than likely linked to an objective, but don't limit yourself that they couldn't also see other gains, is what I would say.
Well, or indeed be linked to multiple objectives, right? So it might be that this initiative that you've designed can help you in multiple ways. So it's one to many. And I think that's quite often the case, particularly if you've got product managers who've been assigned specific OKRs to drive. It's then worth linking up with other product managers and going, well, this is what I'm doing in my space. What are you doing in your space? Are there places where we're helping each other that we don't know about because we've got less understanding of those OKRs?
Yeah, I like the idea of keeping them simple. I think in practice often having one key result is good, but you have to be very, very good at not gamifying it and becoming too driven on moving one lever without being aware of the impact that will have. It's almost, you know, improving conversion is great, but if you drop your basket value to do it, it's not great. So you have to kind of have some context, and that might not be in key results, but you can't pretend that other results are not important when setting these. So that's kind of why I like the idea maybe of always having an anti-metric or something that makes sure that you are staying focused on the objective. But equally, that doesn't have to be something you call out, because hopefully it doesn't maybe drive your focus as much. So yeah.
I agree. I think it's really context dependent, isn't it? So, and it depends what you're working on. You might have an OKR around doing a migration or a change to a platform, for example, and it might be that that is one initiative to achieve that. But then you might be doing something that's more website optimization led, and actually you might have hundreds of small changes that you're doing that will enable you to achieve that key result. So I think it's very dependent on what you're working on at the time.
Yeah, thank you all. This next question is from Carlos. So yeah, unmute whoever would like to answer this first. Have you ever seen OKRs first adopted by the or a product team and later taken up by the entire organization?
I cannot claim the entire organization part, but I did have success with an organization that was quite traditional in the sense of their project planning, so long years long, slow moving kind of development, where we started with OKRs in just the smallest sort of product pod teams that were working towards a couple of problems, and we started to see them adopt that over kind of traditional sort of ways of tracking progress, and really start to embrace them and want to participate them in as well. So I've seen them go up into different levels of an organization or different areas or even different parts of the organization, not even in product development. So I think there can be success in that. It sort of seeds and then and grows. But yeah, I can't claim the entire organization part, but maybe someone else on the panel can.
Yeah, I mean, so when we built out OKRs at Not on the High Street, we did do it in an entire organization way. So the idea is that the entire organization is meant to be focused on those OKRs. The practice is maybe a little harder. I think certainly some teams, particularly teams that are used to trading and operating in a specific way around how they sell and the trading cycle and the trading calendar, it just doesn't fit those teams as well as it does a product team or a technology team. So maybe, Carlos, a return question would be, is it even valuable for the entire organization to have adopted OKRs? Or actually, for some parts of the organization, their OKRs not a particularly effective tool, particularly if you're a more demands-driven function, like a customer service team, or you are a more tactically driven function like a trading team or a social team. OKRs aren't necessarily the best format for every team.
Yeah, thank you, Morgan. Really great answer, and one that is linked to that previous question. So you talked about Not on the High Street. You tried to kind of implement OKRs across the whole organization. Yeah, what are some of the methods you used to make sure that everyone was on the same page when you were doing that?
Yeah, so firstly, I can't take any credit because, again, I've been there 3 months, but I can happily relay what I know about the process and how it worked. So I think one thing that was very important at Not on the High Street is that there was exec down buy-in. So these OKRs were not being delivered from a head of product or a product manager. They were being delivered by our C-suite, by our CEO, our CTO, our COO. We have a weekly meeting called Backstage at Not on the High Street, where everyone in the company joins a call. In fact, that's what I'm going to in 6 minutes time. And each of the OKRs gets a quarterly playback as part of that Backstage. So the whole company gets to understand what work is being done against the OKRs we have and how we're delivering for customers and for our partners through those OKRs. So the conversation continues on a broadcast basis, even to teams that aren't directly involved in those OKRs. So it becomes something that's part of your culture rather than just a management metric.
Yeah, I think that cultural shift that we talked about earlier, yeah, really important one to get right with any new tool that you're trying to use within an organization. Okay, last couple of questions before we wrap up. So I'm going to pass this first one to Holly. How many OKRs should you set?
So I think the key to this is an achievable number. So, you know, I think the guidance is often 3 to 5 OKRs, but less is really, really more in this. And I'll always say it's far better to set one OKR that you actually focus on and are going to work towards than set 10. And if you set 10, you're probably not going to meet them realistically. So, you know, I think there's a lot of science around how many things people can remember in their heads at one time as well. So if you can remember, if you've got 3 OKRs and then each of those have if you've got 3 objectives and each of those have 3 key results underneath them, that's 9 things for you to remember. So that's already more than you can hold in your head at one time. So, you know, ideally keep the number small and keep it focused.
Yeah, thank you, Holly. And finally, I'll pass this on to Callum first and jump in if you have any other thoughts on it. Should I have personal OKRs too?
I saw this question. There's a really good Medium blog post about OKRs, which I recommend going and reading. You could share it with people afterwards, maybe, which uses personal OKRs as the example to describe how they should be used. So there definitely is a case for it. I don't personally use them. So I think like a great example of this was saying things like, I'm trying to think back to the blog post. You probably already have something that looks like this in your life. I think a lot of people do. I am saving for a house. That is an objective, and a key result may be however much you are trying to put away, or it's a holiday, or I am trying to hit a target weight, or I'm trying to do X amount of more social things, etc. I think often in life you kind of work this way subconsciously, which is probably where it comes from. It's all the stuff we've talked about today. It doesn't describe everything you're doing. Hopefully it's useful as a way to think, oh, well, I think in the example of the blog post, I need to go to the shops and buy food. Now that is not an objective and a key result. But if you realize that you're not able to save because you're going to the shops all the time and spending all your money on food, it's a useful thing to reflect back. So, I mean, you can do. I think there's definitely a case for it. You probably already do in some way. So yeah, why not have a quarterly review cycle and hire a bunch of people to help you achieve it if you can.
One of the things that I think is quite valuable about applying the OKR structure to personal objectives is a lot of the time we set ourselves personal objectives that are really big and monolithic and scary. I think we can sometimes be worse at doing that with our personal life than we can with our corporate life, right? And using this kind of structure really helps you to break those things down and go, well, to get to that, these are the things I should focus on, these are the things I should do. And the other thing that can be quite valuable there is by understanding that in something that's quite introspective and personal to you and understanding how you would break down an objective into key results, you can potentially then become better at doing this with something that's more retrospective that isn't directly to do with you. So it could help you as a practitioner, even if you're just doing it on paper and then never using it, just to go, what are my personal objectives? And if I were to make OKRs of them, what would they look like? It might then be easier for you to make OKRs for business goals.
Yeah, and there's been research done actually, which was done with some university students. Unfortunately, I can't remember the stats off the top of my head, but it was around that people who write down their personal goals are, I think it was something like 8 times more likely to achieve them than people who don't, and only about 3% of the population do this. So being able to write down and express your personal goals, whether it's in the form of OKRs or a different format, is a really valuable thing. And I think the rhythm of kind of, you know, as Morgan was saying, the rhythm of setting it on a quarterly basis and breaking it, kind of forcing yourself to break down those goals. So it's not, I need to buy a house. It becomes actually this quarter I need to save this much money. It just makes it more achievable. I think it's a really good discipline to get into. You got a bit of my cat in the background then. You're all honoured.
Thank you very much, Holly. And that brings us to the end of our Q&A section. So thank you all for submitting those questions. I hope that, yeah, the answers gave you some useful tools to take into using OKRs in your lives and organisations as well. And also thank you to all of our panellists for their time today. And I'm just going to welcome back Beth from Burnshe, who's just going to wrap up for us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Max. And yeah, again, thank you so much to all of the panelists today for your time and for all your insights and for such a great discussion. And thank you for everyone who joined. We will be sending out the recording of this in case you want to watch it back or share with your teams if anyone couldn't make it. And there will also be a blog post written and sent out next week with the key points and takeaways. And likewise, if you would be interested in speaking at any events in the future with us, we'd love to hear from you. Feel free to get in touch with me on LinkedIn. And also, if you have any more questions for the panelists, please feel free to get in touch with them on LinkedIn as well. So yeah, thank you very much, everyone, and hope you have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.